Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on, well, one of the absolute biggest mysteries out there. What is consciousness? Really?
And not just what it is, but could it be something fundamental, like actually part of the basic stuff of reality?
Exactly. It's a question that's been around forever, hasn't it? Philosophers, scientists.
For centuries. And honestly, we're still scratching our heads mostly.
Right. So to help us navigate this, we've been digging into a great piece from Scientific American by Dan Falk. It's called, "Is Consciousness Part of the Fabric of the Universe?"
And it really focuses on this idea of panpsychism, which sounds kind of wild at first.
It does. So our mission today is to unpack that famous hard problem of consciousness and explore this, well, this ancient idea that's suddenly getting a lot of buzz again.
The idea that consciousness isn't just us, but maybe everywhere. We'll look at the arguments, the counter-arguments, the whole debate laid out in the article.
Okay, so where does this whole puzzle even start? The article points way back, like over 400 years, to Galileo.
Ugh, Galileo. Amazing with math, right? Describing how things move, shapes, sizes, the objective stuff.
Totally. But then he kind of hit a wall. There were things his math couldn't really touch.
Yeah, like subjective qualities. What it's like to see red or taste something sweet, that inner experience.
And he basically said, look, that stuff isn't out there in the world like planets are. It only exists where?
Only in consciousness, he said. His point was, if you took away the observer, all those qualities, colors, tastes, smells, they'd just vanish. Poof.
And that basic split he made, it still kind of haunts us. Science has made incredible leaps.
Oh, unbelievable progress. Understanding matter, energy, the universe.
But explaining how that physical stuff, neurons firing in a brain, actually creates the feeling, the subjective side, that's still the massive hurdle.
It really is. Which brings us to what David Chalmers famously dubbed the hard problem.
Right, the hard problem. How do you get from the physical brain, the water, as Colin McKinn put it,
to the wine of consciousness? How does that transformation happen?
And neuroscientists, they've found correlations, haven't they? Brain activity linked to experiences.
For sure. These neural correlates of consciousness. We know when certain brain areas light up during specific thoughts or feelings, but that's correlation.
It doesn't explain the how the activity becomes the feeling.
Exactly. It doesn't bridge that gap. And because physicalism, the idea that everything is physical, seems to struggle here,
the door opens up for other ideas, which is where panpsychism comes back into the picture.
Right. So panpsychism, the core idea is that consciousness, or maybe some very basic form of it, isn't something special that just pops into existence in brains.
It's more like fundamental, like mass or charge.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is it's a basic property of reality, maybe present in some minimal way, even in the simplest bits of matter. It doesn't just emerge from complexity. It's sort of there all along.
Okay, that's a big thought. And the article stresses this isn't new, right?
Not at all. Goes way back. Plato, apparently.
Yeah.
Later thinkers, too, like William James, Bertrand Russell, they took it seriously.
And now it's having a resurgence. You mentioned Philip Goff's book, Galileo's Error.
Yeah, he argues Galileo basically set science on a path that ignored subjective experience from the start. And the article mentions a recent workshop at Marist College bringing people together just to debate this.
So why now? What's the big appeal of this seemingly radical idea?
Well, the main draw is that it offers a potential way around the hard problem.
How so?
If consciousness, in some form, is fundamental, if it's already part of the basic building blocks, then you don't have the headache of explaining how completely non-conscious stuff suddenly gives rise to conscious experience.
Okay, the mindedness was always there, in a way. You just need to explain how it gets complex, maybe?
Something like that. It sidesteps the need for that seemingly magical leap from non-mind to mind.
And the article mentions some pretty big names considering this, even Chalmers.
Yeah, David Chalmers himself, who defined the hard problem. He's apparently explored a version of it, suggesting maybe even things like photons have some tiny speck of, well, raw subjective feeling.
Wow. Like proto-consciousness and everything.
That's the idea some are floating. And neuroscientist Christoph Koch, too. He makes this argument. If consciousness isn't tied to one specific material, like our brain cells...
If it's substrate independent. Could happen in silicon, maybe?
Right. If that's possible, Koch argues, then it's not a huge leap to think maybe it's a universal property, that the whole cosmos might be suffused with sentience.
Okay, hold on. So it's not about biology specifically, but maybe about complex organization. Then maybe any organization, however simple, has a tiny bit. Is that the thinking?
That's the direction some panpsychists are exploring. It's a really provocative thought, but let's be clear, this is definitely not the standard view.
Right. What is the mainstream scientific and philosophical view, then?
That would be physicalism, often tied to emergentism.
Emergentism. Explain that.
Okay, so emergentism says consciousness is physical, absolutely, but it's an emergent property. Think about water.
H2O molecules.
Right, a single H2O molecule isn't wet, is it? Wetness only emerges when you have lots of them interacting in a particular way.
Okay, makes sense.
So emergentism applies that idea to consciousness, individual neurons, not conscious. But you get, 86 billion of them in a human brain interacting in incredibly complex ways?
And boom, consciousness emerges from that complexity.
That's the dominant view. And the article notes, surveys show maybe a bit over half of philosophers lean this way, but a significant chunk, maybe a third, are looking elsewhere, questioning physicalism.
Like Philip Goff. What's his main argument against physicalism?
Goff basically says, look, we know subjective experience is real. It's the one thing we're most certain of. So any theory of physics, any theory of reality has to be compatible with that known fact.
He thinks physics should actively check if its theories allow for consciousness.
Yeah, because we know that's real, as he puts it. And this ties into what others call the explanatory gap.
The explanatory gap. We touched on that. It's the idea that
even if you knew every single physical fact about my brain, down to the last atom, you still wouldn't know what it's like to be me. That subjective quality is missing from the physical description. Hedda Hasselmerch is quoted making exactly that point.
it's like that thought experiment about Mary, the color scientist.
Exactly. Mary knows all the physics of color, every wavelength, every neural process, but she's lived her whole life in a black and white room.
So the question is, when she finally walks out and sees a red rose for the first time,
Does she learn something new, something beyond all those physical facts she already knew?
proponents say yes. She learns what it's like to see red, and that what it's like isn't captured by physics alone.
And that suggests subjective experience as something more than just physical facts. The zombie argument makes a similar point, asking us to imagine a physical duplicate of a person.
Identical in every physical way, but with no inner life. Just dark inside.
Right. If you can even conceive of that possibility, the argument goes, it implies consciousness isn't automatically guaranteed by the physical structure alone. It's something extra.
And panpsychism tries to fill that extra slot by saying, well, the subjective part was fundamental all along.
That's the hope, yeah. But, okay, panpsychism has its own massive challenges, really big ones.
Touches.
The big one, the one everyone brings up, even supporters like Goff admit it's tough, is the combination problem.
Combination problem, meaning.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, tiny particles have some minuscule bit of consciousness. How do those tiny little bits of feeling, billions and billions of them, combine or add up to my single, unified, complex conscious experience right now?
Yeah, how do they combine? It's not obvious that tiny consciousnesses would just merge into one big one. Like my thoughts, your thoughts, they don't merge, right?
Exactly. How do you get from these supposed micro-subjects to a macro-subject like a human or an animal? How does that integration happen? Goff calls it the serious challenge and says it's where a lot of research needs to focus.
That does sound like a fundamental hurdle. Are there other major criticisms?
Oh, yes. Neuroscientist Seth is pretty blunt in the article. He argues panpsychism basically doesn't really explain anything.
Ouch. What does he mean?
He means it just pushes the mystery down a level. It asserts consciousness is fundamental, okay? But it doesn't explain why my brain configuration gives rise to the specific feeling of seeing blue, for instance, or why consciousness disappears in deep sleep if it's supposedly fundamental.
And he thinks it's not really science, not testable.
Pretty much. He says it doesn't lead to testable hypotheses and calls it an easy get-out from doing the hard work of figuring out the neural basis.
Yeah.
He thinks physicalism, the mainstream view, is actually doing just fine and making real progress.
There was another issue mentioned too, the other minds problem.
Right. Rebecca Chan brought that up. Even if panpsychism is true, how does it help us know what it's like to be a bat or a dog or, if it's everywhere, a rock? We're still stuck inside our own heads. It doesn't give us access to other subjective worlds.
And she raised the point about it maybe being a God of the gaps kind of argument.
Yeah, like, are we just inventing fundamental consciousness to fill a hole in our current understanding rather than finding a real explanation? It's a fair question.
Okay, so beyond this main clash, physicalism versus panpsychism, the workshop explored some related, maybe even more out there ideas.
Like Panpsychism.
Which is?
The idea that the entire universe itself, as one whole entity, is conscious.
Whoa, okay, that's big.
It is. Then there was Paul Draper's psychological ether theory. He suggests brains don't produce consciousness, they sort of tap into it, like accessing a field that's already there.
An ether of consciousness.
Kind of. And Draper apparently thinks this line of reasoning points towards something like a cosmic mind, maybe God.
And there are others. Hoffman, Smolin.
Yeah, Donald Hoffman questioning space-time itself, suggesting consciousness might be more fundamental than space and time. And Lee Smolin with ideas about conscious agents and the universe being made of partial views, which he calls a restricted form of panpsychism. It shows just how wide-ranging the thinking gets.
The article paints a picture of the debate itself at that workshop, especially between Goff and Carroll.
Right. Goff the panpsychist versus Carroll, the self-described hardcore physicalist. Carroll was kind of the unofficial leader of the opposition there.
And their clash really highlights the core disagreement.
Absolutely. You had Goff saying physicalism has gotten precisely nowhere on consciousness, calling it maybe even incoherent.
Strong words. And Carroll's response.
Carroll pushes back, saying, no, physicalism is doing quite well, thank you very much. Consciousness is perfectly real, he agrees, but it's an emergent feature.
Like his analogy of gas. Pressure and temperature.
Yeah, exactly. Individual gas molecules don't have temperature or pressure. Those properties only emerge from the collective behavior of huge numbers of molecules. He sees consciousness the same way, emerging from the collective behavior of neurons.
So when they discuss things like the Mary thought experiment or the zombie argument,
it basically boiled down to Goff saying, yes, those show consciousness is more than physical facts, and Carroll saying, no, they don't. That what it's like is just how we process complex physical information.
Carroll seemed a bit frustrated by the debate sometimes, questioning what physical reality even means.
Yeah, there's a quote where he seems exasperated, like, what is physical reality? It's physical reality. There's nothing that it is. Although, interestingly, he's fine with really weird physics concepts himself, like the many worlds idea in quantum mechanics.
It shows how deep these disagreements run.
Yeah.
But this isn't just philosophy seminar stuff, right? There are ethical stakes.
Huge ethical stakes. Goff really emphasized this, using the example of fish pain.
How does panpsychism or physicalism affect how we think about whether fish feel pain?
Well, Goff argues that if you only look at behavior, does the fish struggle on the hook, you might be missing the most important thing. The inner experience, the feeling of pain. He calls relying only on behavior wrong-headed, even horrific, because for him, the inner life is all that matters.
But Carroll disagrees.
Carroll argues that inner feelings and outward behavior are connected in our world. So observing behavior is a reasonable guide to understanding potential suffering. We don't need to posit fundamental consciousness everywhere to know we shouldn't cause pain if we see signs of distress.
So different views on consciousness lead to different ways of thinking about ethics and animal welfare.
Definitely. It changes how you approach the question of what is it like to be another creature.
So rounding this all up, where do things stand? Is there any consensus forming?
Not really. The article makes that very clear. No consensus at all.
And critics like Seth still feel physicalism has the advantage.
Yeah, Seth emphasizes that physicalism, for all its challenges, has more empirical grip. It connects with experiments, with neuroscience. He thinks it's unfair to say it's failed when it's steadily making progress.
And he points out that panpsychism still doesn't explain the specifics, right? Like why blue feels like blue, or why consciousness switches off under anesthesia.
Exactly. Those remain big, unanswered questions for panpsychism. If consciousness is fundamental, why does it seem so fragile, so dependent on specific, complex brain states?
It sounds like even proponents find it a difficult idea to fully embrace.
For sure. That quote from Yancel Garcia is telling. He leans towards panpsychism because of the problems with physicalism, but he admits, I would love to be talked out of it. It shows just how counterintuitive and radical the idea feels.
Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. We've really wrestled with this huge mystery of consciousness, tracing it back to Galileo, grappling with the hard problem.
Exploring panpsychism, this ancient idea making a comeback, contrasting it with physicalism and emergence, and hearing the debates, the challenges, the ethical dimensions.
It's clear there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
Both sides face really tough questions. But just thinking about these possibilities, it really does stretch your mind, doesn't it? Makes you ponder what it actually means to be conscious.
Absolutely. It forces you to question basic assumptions about reality.
So maybe a final thought for you, listening. Consider your own experience right now. That feeling of being you, reading this, hearing this, is that completely explainable just by the physics and chemistry of your brain?
Or could there be something more to it? Something about that subjective, what it's like, feeling that hints at consciousness being perhaps a much deeper, more fundamental, maybe even more widespread aspect of the universe than we normally think. Something to chew on.